So, good afternoon. This is going to be rather quick, at least I hope. So, I thought I'd talk about forced pregnancies, postpartum depression, domestic abuse, corruption, and how that kind of played out in my case. So, in 1992, I was a student at Danforth Collegiate Technical Institute. At that time, was majoring in law, with science as a second, and cosmetology, which I left during the last year to pursue more OAC credits in preparation for university. I met William at school. He basically followed me around repeatedly, and it got so intense that I started going out a different entrance of the building. And eventually, I guess I kind of got worn down by this. I thought it was almost kind of cute in a way. And I invited him to a party, which he never actually left. Everybody else left the party, and Bill's like, "Well, I like it here. I'm just going to stay." And it was impossible to get him to leave. And then I made the mistake of marrying this guy. So in 1992, I was at the top of my law class on the honor roll. I had no intention on dropping out before getting my diploma, which would have been about 6 months away, give or take a month. Because this would have been, I got married December 3rd, 1993. So in 1992, I guess 92 was the year before, sorry. But so in reality, I met William in 93. I'll correct that because in 92, I would have been single and living on my own in my own apartment. Same apartment, but I just would have been single. It would have actually been 93 that I met him because I married him within months of meeting him, which, by the way, is something I never recommend doing to anyone. I don't care how much you think you're in love. That's a horrible idea. So we got married in 93. Within days, not months, not years, within days of marrying this person, he took over my life. He took over my finances. He controlled everything I did, where I went, who I talked to. And you can imagine as a youth still, because at this time, okay, I'm 19. I didn't even turn 19 yet, actually, because my 19th birthday was the 22nd of 93. So he was 25 and I was 19. So I didn't have a lot of experience with actually dating older guys or even dating guys at all. Because being alone left you more susceptible to people who would come for more like a one-night stand as opposed to somebody who wanted to be in a relationship. So I had one relationship, and I'm not even sure that poor other person wanted to be in it necessarily to the extent that I thought they did. Anyway, so in 93, December 3rd, I married this guy. By March of 94, right? Because December 3rd and then 22nd, and next thing you know, it's going to be 94. By then, I had already been pregnant because he insisted that was my wifely duty to have a baby, despite the fact that I'm like, this is going to interfere with my education. How would I finish my legal assistance course how would I finish law rather if like me knowing that the LSATs take 8 years, it takes 8 years for preparation for law school, plus it takes 4 years to prepare to go. How would it be that I'd be able to pursue my career goals if I had this baby? And I just kept getting met with constant resistance. And then when I wouldn't agree with him, he just did it anyway. You see how that goes? So I did get pregnant. In fact, I got pregnant twice in the same year. The first time I had a miscarriage within 3 months. I pretty much found that devastating. I honestly believed that despite following all the medical advice, that it was somehow my fault, that I could have prevented it, that I was defective. So when I got pregnant the second time, it was not a joyful experience. It was more of him yelling at me and telling me not to have a miscarriage with this baby too, and blah, 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 blah. He wasn't financially supporting the household anymore. He wanted these kids, but he had lost his job. I had not been working yet. I had still been in school. So I ended up having to, after the miscarriage, I was not able to focus on education at all. I spent a fair amount of time crying and just doting what I was doing in life, or Like, if I can't even carry a baby to term, what's the point in trying an education? And I kind of went with that. And then the short version is that I finally just gave in, and he decided again he still wanted to have this baby. Hell with the fact that the doctor said, you need at least 6 weeks to heal. What the hell? Women don't really need time to heal before you make them have another baby, right? So that's how that went. And I got pregnant a second time, which also resulted in a miscarriage. This miscarriage was more serious, and I actually had hemorrhaging, and it was not a good scene. When I came home from the hospital, he had promised that he was going to put all the baby stuff away. But in reality, I got home and the blood that was on the floor from me hemorrhaging was still on the floor. It was a complete and utter disgusting mess. He had left all his food garbage and everything there for me to clean. Well, it's not my job to clean, it's your job. Yeah, imagine the audacity of this person. If you hadn't have miscarried in the first place, you would have been here to do it. Yeah. First husband. Nobody prepares you for that in high school. So then when I got pregnant with Sheldon, I had a very detached feeling about the pregnancy. Like, I didn't want to engage in it. I wanted to kind of be distanced from it. Everybody else was delighted, of course. Oh, you're going to have a baby. We're going to have a granddaughter. We're going to have a son. I'm like, yeah. I'm not even sure it's going to work out. By the time I got to the 5th month, it became apparent that most likely his child would be brought to term. And some of the anxiety I had about him miscarrying him went away. However, the treatment of his father towards me actually intensified and got much worse. And this list of rules that were already intense got much worse. So I became rules like what time I could get up in the morning, what time to go to bed, what clothes I could wear, what was appropriate for a mother to wear as opposed to a regular woman. And the list just went on and on of crazy things. His family was delighted. I mean, his mother was okay, but they were very intrusive. They'd show up when they wanted, uninvited, unannounced, and they'd stay for lengthy periods of time until they felt like leaving. All the time making a mess for me to clean up. So now I get to clean up the mess from the baby, the mess from them, and the mess from Bill. However, I can tell you that despite the fact that I went into the pregnancy with depression, for whatever reason, when I had Sheldon, I didn't suffer any depression. Like, it didn't. It seemed like what most other women went through. I started him off with cloth diapers. He had an allergy to urine. I switched him to Pampers. Me and his father split up and got back together during that time. And then the only time we really were together was long enough basically to get pregnant with William. And by the time I was 6 months pregnant with him, Bill had decided to leave me for the woman he got pregnant while I was pregnant with William because I was too fat to fuck. You gotta love these guys. You can't make this shit up, Canada. So he did leave, actually, and then he came back. And at some point we were living together, and the really reason he only came back is because I decided to go to college. So I went to Success Business College and took a legal assistance course. But when the student loan money came in, all of a sudden Bill came back. He came back, and then William was born. We at some point even came down east, and I refused to stay down here after I found out he was cheating on me. And yet again, I took him back in Ontario under the understanding that I was married to this person and I had a responsibility to raise the kids with him. That lasted till Willie was 3 months old. We were both in college together. He ended up taking off to the casino. He stole the last of the money in our joint bank account that was technically my student loan money, and he had already spent his. And then that was it. He was gone, and I had a fling with Jim. Just one night. Just one night. Why? Good question. I don't have a good answer. If you're a guy looking for one, it's probably not an answer you like. Because I made a mistake, because I was young, because I didn't foresee what I was doing, because because I was wrong. That's it. Because I could tell you it's because I was completely lonely, and also that I knew Bill was cheating on me and just couldn't prove it, but I'm not sure that's something you wanted to hear. Ultimately, the one night stand resulted in the pregnancy of Jesse. Now, once Bill was already gone, I want to make this clear. Bill left before I slept with Jim. However, having said that, we were still technically married and we'd only been split up a couple months, but he didn't just leave me, he left me for the woman he got pregnant while I was too fat to fuck. So at this point, I'm experiencing some anxiety and depression and actually some frustration. I just started going to college. I was doing good in my course. Again, I was at the top of my class, and I had this envisioned future of being a lawyer and helping people fight injustice. And then all of a sudden, everything went away, and the only thing I had left was diapers, formula, laundry, a parade of comments insulting me 1 minute, praising me the next. And Jim was great for the first 6 months. It was like top of the line, best guy ever, except for the fact that he purposely took the condom off in the first place. But when I got pregnant with Jesse, things slowly changed. His family were very controlling. One of the things he did not tell me was that his family were bikers. So I was already pregnant when I found out. He was not a biker. They didn't approve of a lot of what he did. I'm reasonably sure he dated me to piss off his parents because they didn't like blacks. When I was pregnant with Jesse, I had a lot of mixed feelings about my pregnancy with Jesse because I was technically married to somebody else. And I had a lot of shame about that and embarrassment. And what am I going to tell my kids themselves? And then also just this biker thing where his parents would try to force me to drink wine, do things that were just dangerous for pregnancy. And I'd have to go into the kitchen and I'd have to fill up a glass with ginger ale when nobody was looking and dump the wine down the sink so they couldn't see and pretend I was drinking wine while I was pregnant, because otherwise they would try to force the alcohol down my throat. So by the time Jesse was born, I had listened to enough racist comments from his father, like, oh, I hope the baby doesn't look like a nigger. Good news, Chin, he didn't look like a nigger, but you killed him anyway, you fucking racist scum. Sorry, got off track. Okay, so postpartum depression. So when I had Jesse, one of the major things I noticed right away is I had no energy. I cried more than he cried. I simply didn't want to even exist. It was a super challenge taking care of 3 babies in diapers because they were like under 3, so you might as well say 3 babies alone all day. 3 babies in diapers, and I was severely depressed. And because I had dealt with depression before, I might not have known what postpartum depression was, but I knew what depression was. So I reached out to mental health, and they did provide me a support nurse. And that lasted until March 12th of 1998 when Jesse died. When he died, the same second I saw his body, I was incapable of caring for my kids from that second on. And that lasted maybe forever. In reality, I felt that I had somehow been the cause of his death, that if I had not been so sad when he cried, or if I had woken up sooner, or if I didn't let his father put him to bed, or if I wasn't so sad when I was pregnant at the beginning, or if I had praised God more. And by the way, that didn't work. And it got to the point where I couldn't touch my other kids, my other surviving kids. I couldn't communicate with them. Something so simple as reading them a story was beyond what I could do. Once the baby died, came all these cruel and hateful things from both sides of our family. Some people being really glad that Jesse was dead because they didn't want a nigger in the family. And other people explaining to us how incapable we were in the first place, and we should be lucky that he died. None of those comments felt good. And the racial comments that went on, well, it's probably better off you didn't have to raise this blonde baby. How would you explain to everybody how your baby's blonde, but you're not? Well, I don't know. I tell him his father was a blonde, or the person asking the dumb question. And so I went on. So that was the first postpartum. It was so severe, and I ended up getting pregnant with Cerise the same year Jesse died. And Cerise was born. Jesse died in March 12th, 1998. Cerise was born February 3rd. During the entire pregnancy, the situation with me and Jim escalated. The derogatory comments increases. Racist comments were more common. And it was not uncommon for people to reference, well, make sure you take care of yourself so this baby doesn't die too. By the time I was 4 months pregnant, I ended up having to go to a shelter because Jim tried to stab me because he thought I had ended up starting dancing in Ontario. And he had, quote unquote, said that the baby was going to be a prostitute baby, so he had to kill it. So we went to a shelter, and then he and his family convinced me that the kids were better off with a father and a family. So I returned, and his behavior was good for a couple of months. When Cerise was born, it was okay. Like, he wasn't out of control. After Cerise was born, I ended up having to go back to a shelter again after he choked me unconscious while holding the baby. This is the same man who fought me for custody and said everything he told Children's Services was for the best interest of my kid. Well, you would think it might have been in the best interest for my kid for A, not to stab her pregnant mother, and B, maybe not choke her mother unconscious. The baby didn't fall. He ended up catching her. Children's Services did end up being informed after I informed my mental health nurse, but ultimately it then became basically a persecution of me for not being able to control this guy's violent behavior. When I mentioned the many issues that I had, like we lived in a small town, like we worked at the same place at this point, that housing was impossible to get, how am I going to relocate? The housing waiting list was 3 years at that time, which I guess compared to today's standard is good, but we didn't find it good at that point. I needed a house that day, not 3 years. I needed to get rid of my abuser that day, not 3 years later. Ultimately, it ended up with me eventually going back again, with the ultimate result being eventually him finally being arrested and then being put in jail for assault, at which point his sister was given custody over me because I was majorly depressed and was then allowed the opportunity to pimp me out to her friends at the Phillipston. So hello, Devin. We shall meet again, but next time it'll be on my terms, and I'm going to hold you accountable for the shit you and Rose did to all of us. So when Jim left, finally went to jail, most people get upset when their partner goes to jail. Like, I was worried about him because he, sometimes said some racist and stupid shit. But I just felt such a relief the day that the crown attorney had called me and said, we're going to keep him in custody. So for 6 months, all of a sudden, I got to decide when to eat, when to shower, what to talk about, what to do with the children. And it actually turned out that it was easier for the depression not to live with him. I still was depressed. I was still on antidepressants, but I was functioning better. Like, I was getting up and doing more things with the kids. I was spending more time outside of the house. Jim gets out of jail. He gets released on conditions. The conditions are, leave me alone. Well, naturally, the law says he doesn't have to leave me alone because we have a child together. So what does he do? He goes and gets a lawyer and gets visitation. First visit he gets, he picks up the kids. Now, he gets visitation of all three because he had been there since Willie was 6 months old. So the judge decides that makes sense, and I don't have much choice, so I'll go along with it. Within 3 hours of him being given the kids as he demanded, he called me and asked me to come help him because He was walking down the street trying to drive a tricycle and a bicycle and hold a kid's hand, and they took off. Well, how can the kids be taken off with them when you should be supervising them? Why would you take 3 children down a busy street on a bike? And I never really got an answer that I liked. So the answer I came up with is that's not correct parenting. And this was the type of thing he would do all the time. So he would get visitation, but then he would call me after social services buildings were closed. He would call me to come cook the meals, or, oh, well, they like it better when you cook, or, oh, well, I can't get them to sleep because they're used to you reading to them. And then he would, once I got there, he would always end up wanting to do it. Sometimes it would happen, sometimes it wasn't. And then eventually he would use that as a tool and be like, oh, well, we're back together now. Whoa, 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 whoa. Our one night stand doesn't mean I want to go through the hell we went through. And then they would just weasel their way in. And then he had the added advantage of me having a severe mental health issue, because anytime he assaulted me and I got upset about it, he was then able to say, well, maybe you should go spend some time in the psych unit. Maybe you would feel better if you had a vacation. But the vacation I needed was from him. I didn't need a vacation from the kids at that time. I understood how to care for them. I understood the information I learned in the books about early childhood development, and I had support workers in place. But when he got out of jail, his stalking, his constantly accusing every person who ever spoke to me of cheating with me because I'm bisexual. So therefore, that meant anybody who talked to me, he could accuse of cheating on me. And this was the intense life we live. 1 minute, he thinks you're cheating on him. Next minute, he's in love with you and wants to get married. Next minute, he wants to kill you. The next minute, he wants to have 12 more kids, colonize the moon, and be an Elon Musk. Ultimately, this chaos went on forever because his father was a member of the 6th Street chapter of the Hells Angels. His sister was from the Moonstone region, Hells Angels. Those factions don't get along. Jim's father raped Jim's sister when she was 12, ultimately resulting in her leaving home because Sherry was never Chin's child. She was Judy's child and another man, but not Chin's. And I guess, well, she's not my daughter. She's someone's daughter, and I treated her like a daughter, but she's 12 now, so it's okay. Ultimately, this is part of the reason me and her had a bonding experience and were able to communicate for a while. However, she used that against me to pimp me out to her friends and make her pay for her coke habit. So, I had some mixed feelings about that, like I'd like to punch you in the face kind of mixed feelings. Or like I'd like the police to arrest you for human trafficking feelings, since you didn't just do it to me. And it's well known. Either way, So the first postpartum depression was Jesse, and clearly when Cerise was born, it was the same. I was not able to hold her for 3 months. I couldn't hold her. People had to fight with me, and Jim hit me several times just because I wouldn't pick her up. But I thought if I picked her up, she would die, because I believed that I caused it somehow. So I believed if I just was around her a little less, she'd live. And ultimately, I think it was about the 3rd month into this horrible thing of fighting with Jim and wild fistfights and trying to explain to him that you're not racist, that that's not your problem. And even at that point, I clearly said, I think I had another baby too soon. And he just brushed it off as me not loving these kids as much as the other kids, which was bullshit. And at some point, I think I reached out for another support worker. But ultimately, the depression with Cerise never ended, really, until he again got charged with another assault charge. And it took several assaults before he got an assault charge because of children's services. Because I'm like, oh my God, if I keep reporting this, we'll just take the kids. I don't want to report it. I don't want to lose the kids. I don't want it going on. Some of these people should be on my side, and they would be playing these games. On the one hand, they tell me they don't want Jim hitting me, but on the other hand, they'd be calling up children's services. And, well, for instance, Sherry took me out one day, and to get me to do the work I didn't want to do, she pumped me full of cocaine. But after she did that, and we went home, and her brother found out about it, to defend herself, she called up Children's Services and said, I was on cocaine. It's true, I was for one night at that point, but I was not an active user. In fact, that had been my first experience with cocaine. Either way, I was not really able to get people in the positions of power to understand that. And she was actually allowed to supervise me for quite a while and was quite abusive until I had an affair with the same guy she wanted to, and she got rid of me because, her brother was in jail, and I decided at this point, I'm not taking you back because when you get out, you'll be good for 3 months and go back to the way you were. So they claimed it was because of me and my mental health issues that I was the problem, and we could just fix things if I just calmed down. But there was no way to calm down. I went to the store one day, and you see how I like to talk now? Well, that's kind of a norm for me. And I stopped at the store, and I was just talking to some people in the front of the store, and this guy is like freaking out, accusing me of arranging to have kids with them and telling them I'm going to move into their house. And I'm just talking to people on a hot summer day, which guys do, by the way, all the time without ever being accused of fucking somebody. And if you do accuse them, you look irrational. This was certainly the case. Jim's irrational behavior was so bad that he couldn't even invite his own friends over without accusing you halfway through the night of wanting to fuck his friend. Like, I don't even know why his girlfriend wants him, but I certainly don't want him. And this was the type of thing you go through, and then 10 minutes later he loves you, and then he hates you, and then he loves you. And then he would pit me against his family, knowing how dangerous his family was. So your father is a Hell's Angel member, but you sicked him on your girlfriend because she did something you didn't like? Not cool. Ultimately, by the time I was pregnant with Sebastian, I did not experience postpartum depression. What was different about Sebastian's pregnancy, and he was the last pregnancy, was I got pregnant. I weighed 75 pounds, so I had no idea. I didn't think I could get pregnant. I hadn't had a period for a year. I was barely eating. I just assumed I couldn't. I assumed I couldn't because there was no period. I had contacts, and that is the way I found out I was pregnant, because I couldn't get the contacts out, and the eye doctor had asked me, hey, do you know the shape of your iris has changed? I'm like, well, how would that happen? So he was nice enough to explain that when you're pregnant, the shape of your iris changes. So by the way, if you've got contacts, remember that. So then he told me, he said, maybe you should see your doctor. Well, I went and got my own pregnancy test. And of course I had some babysitters living with me at the time. And I'm in the bathroom looking at this test. So I'm like, nah, that's impossible. So then I go tell my friend, he's like, well, this is probably not something that you can just guess about. It's probably something you should actually see your doctor about. So I finally agree to go see my doctor, who sends me for an ultrasound. So by the time I get to the ultrasound, I'm 8 weeks pregnant, but I'm pretty darn skinny. So you could imagine that this baby I didn't know I was pregnant with had no nourishment up to that point, and whatever habits I had, because I had not known I was pregnant, still existed. So I explained that to the doctor, and he sent me for what's called a level 1 ultrasound, which is basically an ultrasound to see if there's any permanent damage from drug use. As I hadn't been actively using, but I had certainly been using during that time frame because I had not known I was pregnant yet. So it was between the 6 and 8 week mark. I did the level 1 ultrasound, and then I actually arranged, at the harassment of many people in the community, including Sebastian's father, who kept trying to kill me for having this baby against his will. So he actively tried to run me over with his motorcycle repeatedly until I made an arrangement with him not to put his name on the birth certificate. That was the first thing I did different, is make an arrangement ahead of time that's in the best interest of the child. It's not in his best interest for his father to try to kill me every day. But in particular with Sebastian, his father was Indigenous, so there was a lot of racism that I experienced during that pregnancy that I didn't experience as much, like I did with Jesse because of Jim's father. I didn't experience the racism as much with Cerise because we had moved to Moonstone. And then, but with Sebastian, it was constant. It's like people were like, well, you don't really want a native baby. It's just going to grow up to be a bum. These are things people would say to me while I was pregnant. Didn't matter. I went through that pregnancy alone. I was still a dancer, so I danced up till the first 6 months of that pregnancy because weighing 75 pounds meant that even when I gained weight, I still didn't look like I gained weight. By the time I was at the 7th month of the pregnancy, I had finally decided, 7.5 month, I had finally decided that this was not a job I could technically do while pregnant anymore, despite how skinny I was. And I'd stopped that job and ended up having to be on assistance, of course. And being on assistance had some drawbacks, like not having enough money to eat healthy. But also that had some drawbacks was being forced to be at a certain weight and having eating problems for so many years as a result of trying to maintain a ridiculous weight that wasn't possible. Like, the weight they expected strippers to be at was unrealistic for their body weight and size and age. And unfortunately, at that time, I was not able to see that. I was just seeing it as like a failure. What do you mean I can't weigh just this? I did not see 75 pounds as a good weight because I thought I should weigh 70, which was really ridiculous because my doctor's like, no, you're supposed to weigh 100 something, you fool. The opposite. By the time I was right before delivery, it was about 5 weeks before, or 5 weeks before I delivered, because he was born 6 weeks early. 5 weeks before I delivered, I went to a prenatal checkup, at which point the doctor was nice enough to explain to me, you have one or two options, either eat more food or stay here. I'm like, well, I don't like hospitals. I don't care how nice you're being. I don't trust you. Plus, you tried to send me home when I was in labor cerise because you tried to tell me maybe I peed my pants when my water broke. If I hadn't fought with you, she'd have been born at home in the dirt. So no. Anyway, needless to say, I had some trust issues going on there with the doctors. But I agreed with the doctor that I would make an appointment the next week and eat more. So I did gain the allotted weight that the doctor had asked by the time I went to the next appointment. And within 2 weeks of that appointment, or less, I ended up going into labor. Oddly enough, Sebastian is one of the preterm babies that I had because Sheldon was preterm. So he was born much closer to term because he was born at 37 weeks. So some doctors just considered that term. Willie was born at 36 weeks. Cerise, on the other hand, was the smallest baby who was born at 35 weeks, and Jesse was born at 36. So when Sebastian was born, he was, unlike the other babies, he didn't have any stress from me being physically assaulted during pregnancy. He did have some of the stress of me dealing with the emotional issues. I had support workers. I had support groups, so I was near other pregnant women and not just Jim's family. I parted with Jim's family to some extent and had some independence and independent supports and had intentions on keeping those in existence. When I went into labor, for some reason, Children's Services showed up because I was a single parent with 4 kids. So they asked me if I needed anything. I'm like, well, this baby was born at 36 weeks. I don't have diapers yet. So they got him. So thank you for that, Aurelia people. Also, I would like to point out, because I know there's been a lot going on about children's services and the Indigenous community, my experience with children's services in Aurelia was tolerable given the situation, because they would maybe not have understood coercive control either. They would not have understood the severity of his family's behavior on me. Putting Jim in jail did nothing, because his entire biker family and bikers all were still there for him. Even though the bikers were supposed to have an explicit rule not to hit your wife, especially if she was pregnant. So you see, my problem with the organized criminals is they're running around acting like they did no wrong. But 5 children suffered because of the no rat piece of shit rule that you forced us to follow, including the fact that somebody killed Jesse and nobody will tell the truth. So the corruption thing is that there had to have been Hell's Angel members within the Parliament and within Children's Services Division. I hope you're going to weed that out. As I saw with the case of Antonio Pinch Brown, you guys do not put kids where they're safe. You didn't even take Antonio Pinch Brown. You let his mother kill him. And she only killed him because he wasn't white. Now, that was the other thing I wanted to mention during my pregnancies. It was very distressing to have conversations about what color the child might be. As with Megan, I also had to listen to people discuss my child like they were a breeding horse. Oh, well, maybe you won't get that nappy hair. Maybe it'll get your hair. And little offensive comments. So I got something to say on behalf of all the mixed children everywhere. Fuck off with your bullshit about what we're going to look like when we pop out of the hole. Because most of us are going to die before we hit 20 thanks to our governments. So back to the postpartum thing. So when I look back at the pregnancies, my advice to younger people is one at a time, space them out a lot longer, and you don't need to have a baby with somebody to prove you love them. Think about that. If they don't believe that you love them, maybe you should just split up. You don't need to drop out of high school and get married and have a baby and then become too fat to fuck, so they got to go have another baby. You don't have to do that. Instead, hear me out here. Continue with your career goals or whatever goal you have. Continue with your birth control. And when you're ready, whenever that might be, then choose to have a kid. But if you could learn something from my story, it would be that the closer your pregnancies are together, the more likely you are to suffer psychosis. And I guess that's a warning that I'd like to give you. The inability to understand the difference between reality, a psychotic break is a real possibility with back-to-back pregnancies like that, especially if there's pregnancies and miscarriages in between. So I had 9 pregnancies altogether, and 5 of those were live births. No, I've had 8, sorry. 8 and 5 were live births. Having said that, the first pregnancy I had, I was 19. The last was 28. So I don't know what you did in your youth, but in my youth, I delivered babies. I often get comments from people that I act younger than they think I should at this age. And I often think that sometimes I'm just learning the stuff I didn't have an opportunity to learn when I was younger because I was busy trying to be a good parent. Whether or not I succeeded doesn't matter. Well, I guess it does matter, but I was trying to be a good parent. That's why I called Cotalpa Tamarack and asked them to come and see the kids. It was quite obviously the 2 oldest kids suffered from learning issues. So both of them were 18 months behind. I had them assessed, and then we had somebody come in and help with building skills. My assessment, on the other hand, didn't come for learning disabilities until I went to college in 2014. So if I had have known that information sooner about myself, I'm sure I might have made some different decisions. But on the other hand, the Hells Angels had a strong hold on the city of Toronto, on Moonstone, Aurelia, and Barrie. And I wonder if I would have ended up killed, if I would have fought any harder to leave. As it was, I was held at gunpoint for 3 months. As it was, I was repeatedly tortured once I got here. And I'm just wondering how that would have worked when you're pregnant with somebody's kid. How do you just go? Because both times I went back and I got chastised for that. And I'm now going to defend myself for that because I believe that the reason the child was born alive and not dead is because I went back. Unfortunately, I also believe that because I went back, I caused my own children damage that I didn't want to cause them. The problem is that the system was set up back then so only the abusers win. So I thought that was going to change, and unfortunately, here in Nova Scotia, it's worse than Ontario. So you know how when you're in Aurelia and you're waiting for an OPP and you're like, they're not going to make it, I'm going to die first? Well, here, you die first. The cops don't make it. The cops sit there like, nah, let's not go in and do that. Ultimately, we have the worst cops in Canada, and that's saying something here in Halifax. But as far as childbirth and forced pregnancies goes, the problem with a forced pregnancy is when somebody forced me to have a baby, they didn't do any mental health screening or nothing. So some of the disorders that I have that are hereditary that cause my kids lifelong problems were passed down without anybody ever considering if that was a good idea. Is it a good idea to pass down severe anxiety and depression? Because I didn't know enough about mental illness, and I consider it contagious for your kids, as far as I'm concerned. Like, they obviously caught what was wrong with me. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be anybody trying to cure mental illness. Sure, they want to give you some medication. They want to give you lots of medication, thousands of dollars of medication. No cure. They want a cure for cancer, but no cure for mental illness, and I wonder why. Anyway, so I don't know how to explain to you the type of person I was in my 20s compared to now, because it's so different. The person I was in my 20s, whether I should have felt fear or not, did not. I was fearless in the same way a child would be willing to go in with a caged lion. I was willing to hang out with all kinds of people until I realized what they were. And then I couldn't get away from them because nobody ever trained me how to get away from these people. Especially when these people have weapons. And like some of the things I experienced when I was pregnant was watching a woman be beat with a baseball bat. Not overly happy to see that. And not being able to tell the authorities due to fear for your own children's safety was a real issue in our lives. Ultimately, I can't help but wonder if the postpartum depression or depression itself wouldn't have been so severe in the first place if I didn't have to deal with a criminal family. Now, you can picture yourself dealing with a difficult family, but imagine if that family were the Hells Angels. Imagine if anytime you did something wrong, you had the risk of being murdered. Something so simple as not putting the supper on table on time, not making gravy, not talking to the kid enough, talking to one kid apparently more than the other, and the list of things that those people think you did wrong go on, or just plain talking when you're not supposed to because you're a woman and you're not supposed to talk. And this was the daily stress, and the whole time I'm trying to raise my children to be treated equal in an environment where I'm not even being treated equal. And ultimately, I failed at that. By the time I ended up here, I got a lot of lost of faith in myself and my ability to do the things that I once was able to do. And that's kind of the spot I'm stuck in right now. Like, I feel incapable of doing the things that I was once highly capable of doing. Editing a document, sitting still long enough to finish the seminar, not lashing out every time you hear about the police, because it turns out the police are doing so much wrong that there's no point in being mad all the time. I can tell you that the postpartum depression was better when I had a mental health nurse and not the father of the child. Everybody assumes that the support you need is the father of the child, but I found that he was very judgmental, that although he was bipolar and expected everybody to understand that, he was very critical of my mental illness, and he often told people, oh, don't mind Cerise, she's crazy, blah, 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 blah. And this is how people or the crazy mom, and ultimately, I didn't feel supported a lot in Nova Scotia. When I came here with the children, I lost a severe amount of supports. In fact, actually, the day we left Aurelia, I shouldn't even say the day we left for Nova Scotia, the day we left for Aurelia, and went to stay in the shelter in, what was it, Oshawa? Or one of those areas, like Whitby area, because I ended up in Brampton at the end of it. But I didn't know people in Brampton. I wasn't the city. I mean, I left Toronto in 92, 93. Well, 90, or not 93, 96 rather, after Jesse died. Wait, 98, sorry. Let me get it straight. So in 1998, Jesse died. The same year we moved to Moonstone. I didn't move back to Toronto. I worked in Toronto. I did not move back. And Toronto got huge while I was gone. And Brampton was just like a village. It was more like Spryfield is now. And when I got there, I just found it overwhelming. And I now found out the answer, Mississauga. So the shelter was in Mississauga. That would have been the family, Honey Churchill Family Life Resource Center. And then they got us housing and we moved. I was overwhelmed living in housing in Brampton. Right away, there were drug dealers everywhere. There was crime everywhere. I was so unprepared for the level of crime that I now had to face. And also, it put me in the direct line of the Hells Angels I was in conflict with. So, the Hells Angel member that held me at gunpoint went to jail. I was definitely not going to be protected. I wasn't going to be killed, but you're not being protected. And I don't think anything that was good for depression. Certainly being kidnapped by my own family and relocated here where there were zero supports wasn't helpful. Once I got here, my mental health deteriorated severely. One of the first things that happened here was I had a copy of my transcript, and I had given it to the Valley African Nova Scotian Development Association in Kentville to help me with my job search. And then Lincoln Lord, the pervert who just was running around fucking the clients, lost it. And after that, everything just kind of started to spiral downhill. I had no more opportunity to get the job that I was trained for. My family told everybody that I was a stripper and a whore. So every time I went somewhere, I was ostracized. And even my kids were made fun of at school because of it. Ultimately, by the time they actually took the kids, I spent more time thinking about suicide than them. And that was pretty much a daily occurrence of thinking of ways to escape this inescapable situation where to even that day, I still had some sort of contact with Jim's family because the judge just doesn't get it. Well, they have a right, they're grandparents, but most grandparents abuse their rights and allow their sons to actually be abusive to their ex-partners. And that's unfortunate that they do that. For instance, Jim's mother has kept Sheldon on her Facebook all this time, and anytime me and Sheldon have a conflict, she just, well, I wouldn't have treated you like that. Well, if I'd have been with you, just knock it off, Judy. You were with us, and you left. Okay? So you were here once. And also encouraging my son to be involved with Jim's relatives that are organized criminals wasn't helpful either. And because Richard Geisler was your choice, you didn't make very good choices either. He tried to kill us, and we weren't dating you. So, do I forgive you? Nope. Do I understand? Sure. So, I'm just wondering how much of that depression was even depression, given the fact that I was forced to fend for myself with a group of organized criminals. We're not talking about just a group of bullies. We're talking about a group of organized criminals that are worldwide. And I was expected alone as one mixed person to stand up, fight for custody, demand it because I had the right. And unfortunately, the Hells Angels really didn't agree with me. So I really don't agree with people when they look me up on YouTube to tell me that the Hells Angels are good people. 500 of your good people were at my son's funeral bragging about how they killed the nigger baby. The nigger baby that didn't look a thing like me. Blonde hair, blue eyes, he looked just like his father. And that wasn't enough to save his life. So you see, I have a hard time calling it depression when I feel like it's a reaction to the trauma of knowing my son was murdered and never really being able to prove it. Having the knowledge but not being able to prove it is worse than not knowing at all. And that's why it's been well over 20 years since he died. And I feel like it was just yesterday. When I wake up in the morning, I, for some reason, expect him to be here again. He never is, of course. So I just want to let you know that it's fun to run around making fun of the crazy people. I know you're having a good time, right? You can make fun of every person that has a mental illness except your own. And it's nice to give people titles. But what I want to know is why the provincial and federal government couldn't have coordinated better when I called my lawyer in Ontario and said my father kidnapped me. That was a serious accusation. How come when I called the Ontario lawyer, nobody in Ontario looked into it and it was just brushed off? And that's kind of what led to the end of me caring for the children, because when I lived in Mississauga and Brampton and Aurelia, at that point, I'd been caring for them as a single mother in limited visitation. When my family kidnapped us, they forced us back into a relationship where we had to work together and live together. We hadn't been living together because he kept hitting me and because he wouldn't stop. So being forced to live with them ultimately resulted in the same thing, and then that resulted in children's services showing up in an open file. But ultimately, it was Andy Green, the native guy, who sent me into the worst spiral of depression other than here in HRM. And he would constantly, he waterboarded me. He would drop water on my head and wake me up in the middle of the night. He would sit there and poke my forehead like this constantly, over and over and over again, screaming in my face. And then there'd be days he didn't talk to me for days. He still expected me to cook for him, clean for him, have sex with him, but he literally didn't talk to me. It was the most eerie situation. My kids were little, none of them were his, of course. He was military, just retired. He was 30 years my senior. He just showed up out of nowhere and literally took over. When I tried to split up with him, that ended up in several violent encounters, which resulted in children's services showing up. Because I had just had problems with Cerese's father recently, that made it worse. Ultimately, at the end of it all, I was such a wreck that I no longer even knew how to communicate with my own kids. And most of the time I just spent trying to figure out, how am I going to get Andy not to break a bone or freak out? And I had no idea that my children had been left alone with him and abused until the day they came to my work to serve me the notice of taking into care. So by then I was working in online support, doing technical support. And still that wasn't enough for society. Off they went. They took him into care. That did not stop the violence from Andy. In fact, it made it worse. He blamed me for being charged with assaulting my kids. I'm like, well, first of all, I didn't leave you in the care of my kids alone ever. How did you get in the care of my kids alone? And the answer to that was my greedy Aunt Juanita. You see, because I was depressed, nobody believed anything I said. Greedy Aunt Juanita is the reason he was left alone with my kids. I paid her to babysit, but she had boarders, so she had to go home and feed her boarders. As a result, she took my kids home 3-4 hours before they were supposed to be taken home and left them with Andy, who she knew suffered from PTSD. So, and I want to say something to the Indigenous community. You might be waiting for the Pope's apology, or you might have gotten it, but I don't want the Pope's apology. I want an apology from your community for the shit that was done to my kids by your stupid person who suffered PTSD. Because you know why? He had access to military counseling. He had access to military training. He had access to regular schools, and he took all of that. And then to say that the residential school is the reason you choked my child is unacceptable to me. Not only that, not only did he choke my child, but I'm going to propose the reason he choked my child is because my child was defending me. And he didn't like that. Whether or not I was there, he said something about me and the kid defended me. Life with him was so violent. At the end of our relationships, he had broken both my wrists, and I had 2 black eyes to the point I couldn't see for 3 weeks. Then he paraded me all around town so all the other girls could see that, and all the guys. Bragging. He even stayed at my aunt's house, so if I wanted to go visit my aunt, I had to wait until he wasn't there. Ultimately, it eventually ended with me hating my aunt to the point I never wanted to be near her. And I might never have gotten out of that relationship at all, but I ended up losing the kids. I ended up not being able to do what I was supposed to. They were put in foster care. Once they were in foster care, there was really no more counseling for me. I waited on a waiting list at Valley Regional for a while, and eventually I got with pill-popping Mr. Mulhall, who just gives you some pills, and actually it did kind of alleviate some stress for a while to be on medication. So, yeah, basically, I'm not going to go into my story about Lawrence at all, because I got distracted, but the violence in the pregnancies, the increased violence correlated with the severe depression. Not saying it's a cause, I'm saying there's a correlation between the severe violence and the severe depression. There's also a correlation between the severe violence and psychosis, and the severe violence and my miscarriages, as well as my increased inability to feel empathy and compassion. Ultimately, the hardest year I had with feeling empathy and compassion was the year they tied my tubes. They told me if I got my tubes tied, I'd get my kids back. And then the day I got my tubes tied, they served me with a paper telling me they were keeping them permanently. So really, they just didn't want the nigger having no more nigger babies. Oddly enough, I hadn't been trying and was on birth control that was working. So they didn't need to do that. But there you go. That's Canada for you. Anyway, that's kind of what it was like for me to have depression and psychosis and throughout the years in dealing with criminals. And I just, given the fact that the police are afraid of these people, I'm just wondering if somebody can explain to me what it is I could have done different given the information I was provided at that time. And given the fact that I watched people be brutalized and was unable to save them because if I tried to save them, I was brutalized too. It did not mean I wanted to watch. Most of the time when you were forced to watch somebody have something violent happen to them, it was for the sole purpose of reminding you that the very same thing could happen to you. Ultimately, living under this level of stress for over 20 years, like, oh, are the Hells Angels going to try to kill me today, got me to the point where I am now, where it's like, no, it's Reese versus the Hells Angels. Fuck them. Fuck you. You took advantage of my mental illness. You took advantage of it so that your kid could get away with abusing me when he should have been treated. For that matter, we probably both should have been treated at that time. You made it impossible for me to seek the mental health resources I needed. And you're ultimately a pedophile, Chin. If there is one thing I'd like to say to you, it's that you destroyed your son's life, and for no other reason than you are inadequate. You are a woman-beaten piece of shit, as is most of your agencies. Now, Hell's Angels, that's your piece of shit. That's what you created. Who brags at a 9-week-old baby's funeral? I can answer that. You do. Goodbye.